All right, shall we get going? All right. For those of you who were here before, welcome back. For new people, welcome. I like to think of this as the funnest room of the three. It's got the most spirit. So I'll go through the introduction very quickly. My name is Brandon. This is my background. It's in the slides. We'll get into it. So this particular presentation, it came to light over many years of like helping teams out. And one of the questions we always got was like, how do you go from A to B? How do you go from this new game came out to that robot that you guys came up with? Because we never thought of something like that, or we bit off way too much. And so that's what this presentation is focused on. It's how do we take a brand new game, and it applies to FRC obviously, but it could apply to FTC or FLL or VEX or any other competition that you guys would get involved in. So we want to take those first 2 or 3 days that you spend in the build season, or those 2 or 3 decision days, if your team does that, and really underline the importance of them, because you make decisions that are going to really affect the rest of your season, all the way through competition season in those early days. So you want to make sure we're methodical, we want to be systematic, and we want to take an approach that will consistently produce good choices for our team. And so we want to organize that build season and, like I said, create a process that works for your team, and you want to create that consistency year to year. So this is the disclaimer for it. There's a lot of history to FRC. There's a lot of teams that have done this before. There's a lot of teams that have figured out how to do this even better than we have. But the approach that we take works for us, and it does come from years of trial and error. This is my 14th year leading the Neutrons, which means that I've tried and failed many, many times as far as creating a good process for us to follow. And we're still working on it. We're still honing it. And it's still being tweaked as we move along. But this is how we do it. And it does work. And it has produced really consistent results for us. So that being said, take whatever pieces you want from this, use them as you want. And if you have any questions or comments or suggestions, I'm always happy to hear them or field them. So here's the formula. And like I said, I really went over the top to try to make this like a piece by piece flow chart. There's some areas of this where it becomes a lot harder to say this is the exact step and just rinse and repeat and turn the crank and it comes out. And that comes out more towards the number 6 and number 7, number 8 steps. And I'll talk about it as we get through there. But this is it. This is the step by step. So the first part is going to be using our goals. Then we're talk about understanding the rule book and how important that is. We're going to do a detailed scoring analysis and talk about what that looks like, how we do it, outline potential robot skills and robot characteristics that a robot might have for an FRC competition. Then we're going to do a time-based analysis. I'll explain what that means. We'll talk about what a robot and alliance that wins or is successful looks like and conceptualize that. We're going to go back and look inward one more time and understand what we're capable of, what our team is capable of, and how do we fit into a winning alliance. We're going to strategize, and that's kind of part of that piece. Then we're going to have to make some group decisions, which is always a fun process in its own. And then we actually have to get to work. So we have to do all this stuff before we can even really start getting into things. And so starting at step 1, for those who were just here before, we talked about goals. For those who are new, I spent a lot of time talking about goals and how important it was. And the biggest takeaway, the main point I would recommend is that it's not the specific goal that matters as much as it is the team being aligned around the common goal. Getting everyone moving the same direction is the important point about having goals. And that's all about buy-in. Everyone who's working on the problem at hand is bought into the same level of success that we want to get to. Understanding the rule book. So who's read through a FRC rulebook before? How long does it take? Yeah, it's deep. And so if you take someone, you guys are, I'm going to pick on you a little bit. You guys are new. I'm going to give you a brand new book, plop it down in front of you that's like that thick, and I'm going to say you need to read every piece of this for you to go and be a participant in FRC. It's going to be really, really difficult to motivate you to do that, mostly because you haven't seen why that's important or why it's not. And the reality is you don't need to read every word of every piece of it. But when it comes to the game and the robot side of it, you want to go through it and you want to understand it, every piece of it that's inside there. So what we do, we read the manual. We start separately. So if you guys have been to our kickoff here before, kickoff day is a unique one for us because there's about 50 teams that come here. They pick up their kits. We distribute their kits. So for day one for build season for the neutrons, we don't do anything for the neutrons. We're just here and we do kickoff. Then we go home. But we give everyone some pretty serious homework, and that homework is that they have to read the manual by themselves, at least those two sections I mentioned, the game and the robot. Then we come back together and we read it together again. And usually there's a lot of rules that are very straightforward. We understand. But I would say probably 10 to 15% of the rules that are out there and some of the things in the rule book, they have question marks around them, or we don't understand why they're in there, what the purpose is. We don't understand what it's exactly trying to clarify. So reading them together again, it helps us all understand where the holes are for us, where the missing pieces of knowledge are. And so we write down those unknown questions, and we know that we have to go back and get answers to them at some point. And we try to get quickly, through the strategies that are illegal and productive, or just, bad ideas, the things like, let's, block the other team completely, put up a big wall, get through that stuff. The rules are there to keep that stuff from being there. Let's spend our time focused on things that are going to actually, be offensive and win us some matches. So now we start getting into the meat of things. And I didn't say this before, but if you guys want to stop me at any point, just stop me. There's no formality here. So we're going to understand how to score. That's the objective of the detailed scoring analysis. We want to review the scoring details in the manual, and then we want to list all the ways to score the points, and we want to do it in a pretty clear, organized fashion so that we just basically understand what's going on. The past few years, First has gotten good about putting summary tables into the manual. So you'll see like a scoring summary that says these points are worth here and whatever. We go through it again, we put it into a Google spreadsheet that we share with everybody, mostly so that everyone's reminded. It's one of those things where just by reading it, saying it, and understanding it, it kind of locks it into the longer term memory. And then we also want to be able to start listing it out so that we can use the spreadsheet in other places as we go down the process here. So this game was a 2016 game. It involved defenses. So there were several different defenses that were laid out on the field. Your robot had to cross the defenses. They ranged from things like a drawbridge gate to teeter-totter style mechanism to like a bumpy road to a moat, which was basically like a channel that your robot had to drive through. So there was a few different defenses, and that's what all these things that say cross, whatever, those were the names of the defenses. Then at the same time, you could score a boulder. So once you cross the defense, you can go into the courtyard, which was the scoring area around the tower, and you could either take the boulder and you can put it in the low goal, or you can take it and you can fire it up into the high goal. Robots were restricted in height, so you couldn't place a boulder into the high goal. It had to be launched in some capacity into the high goal. So that's how you see, the different point values for boulder in the top, boulder in the bottom. And then at the very end of the match, there was a climbing bonus. So if you latched onto the tower and lifted yourself off the ground, you got a point bonus for that. Challenging the tower, which was basically parking on the skirt of it. There was a ramp that went around it. If you just parked on the bottom, you got a bonus for that. And then there were different point values for autonomous and teleop. So that's all that's spelled out. And then there's these big pieces down here. So one RP, or one ranking point. In our tournament strategy, a ranking point is what's used to rank teams, from top team to bottom team. If you win a match, you get 2 ranking points. And again, this is all subject to change. It probably won't, but it could. I don't know what's going to happen in the future. But this is probably how it will be. A win will give you 2 ranking points. And then there will be additional tasks or tasks inside the game that your alliance can perform that can earn you additional ranking points. So in this case, capturing a tower was worth a ranking point in qualifications. That meant scoring 8 boulders into the tower. If you can get 8 boulders into it, the tower would be defeated. And you also had to have 3 robots either parked or climbed on the tower. So you needed 8 boulders in and all 3 robots on the base of the tower to get a capture. And then breaching defenses, if you completely defeated 4 of the 5 defenses, which meant crossing them twice was how you defeated one. If you defeated 4 of the 5, you got a ranking point as well. And then in eliminations, those ranking points go away because we're not worrying about seeding anymore, and they're assigned a point bonus. So that was detailed scoring analysis. Pretty straightforward. We're just listing all the ways we can score in a clear, organized fashion. So after we've done that, we now want to make a robot menu, as I like to call it. Basically, we want to list anything in the game a robot could do. And this entire time, we're not talking about how they're doing it, or if it's possible. It's just these are things that robots could do. And they start really basic. Some of them, sometimes we forget the really basic ones because they are so basic, but it's important to write them down. In this particular game, driving was a very important skill, especially driving in certain areas. So you can see from driving, driving over small bumps, driving on ramps. We had a lot of different drive items. Then we had, herding boulders and holding boulders. Herding meant basically, kind of shuffling a boulder along without actively controlling it. Holding a boulder meant that we had, grasped onto it and we were now holding onto it. Receiving a boulder from the human player. There was 2 human player slots, one high and one low. Picking a boulder up off the ground, that was a big part of it. Oftentimes we'll have picking up we'll break that down to even like picking up from the front of the robot and picking up from the back of the robot. 2 distinct skills, and we chart them out on the robot menu. Shooting a boulder, letting go of a boulder, holding the drawbridge open or dropping it down, the portcullis, which was the gate mechanism that you could lift up and down. There's a teeter-totter mechanism. So all these were, distinct kind of specific movements that you could do to the field itself. Limbo. So the one of the defenses that was always there was a low bar, and it was a 12-inch high bar, which meant that your robot basically had to be less than 12 inches to go under it. So limbo was like a robot configuration. You didn't have to be under 12 inches all the time, but you had to get there eventually if you wanted to go under that. So that was a big potential design constraint. Climbing the tower, defending, basically just meaning playing defense. Dislodging itself, dislodging others, that would be something like an active mechanism that you could use to unstick yourself if you got to that point. So anyway, those are the robot skills. And then what we do is we go and we identify what skills we need to accomplish what tasks in the game. So you can see required skills, meaning like you absolutely need to be able to do this to do things. So crossing the defenses, you can see all of them required 1 and 3, which was driving. Robot had to move, and driving on a ramp, because every defense had a little bit of a ramp that started it. So every one of them needed 1 and 3. But then some of them only needed 4, which was driving on most terrain or driving on rough terrain. Some of them needed like a 13, which was, holding the drawbridge or dropping the drawbridge down. Some of them needed a 16, which is pushing down the ramps. So those needed, kind of specific items. And you keep going down, you look at, all right, I want to score a boulder in the top goal. I need to be able to drive because I need to be able to get a boulder. I need to be able to hold onto that boulder because I need to be able to hold it across the defense. I need to be able to pick the boulder up, because it's laying somewhere on the field. And then I need to be able to launch the boulder. Those are just fundamental skills. That's not talking about like how consistent I shoot the ball, how do I line up to the goal? How do I get over the defense? How do I hold the boulder? How do I pick up the boulder? Not talking about any of that yet. It's just basic fundamental things that we're talking about the robot will need to do. And then if we look down as you get to the bottom, capturing the tower, it doesn't seem like you actually needed all that much. You needed to drive, get over a bump, and you needed to drive on a ramp. If all your robot did was go through the low goal, so it was short, so probably we should have had a limbo in there as well. But if all it did was drive and grab boulders, we should have been able to capture a tower as long as we could get our partners on the ramp with us. But if we look at breach defenses, to be able to do all the defenses, we needed a lot of separate skills. And it doesn't mean that every one of these things requires a separate mechanism per se, but it means that the mechanism that we design needs to be able to do all of those things. So it's just one way to think about that. So that gives us kind of the rough scope of what we're trying to do with the robot skills. And then we get into, once we have that kind of nailed down, we get into the probably most time-intensive part of the process, which is the detailed time-based analysis. So our objective here for this is to determine the realistic point values that various robots and alliances can score. So we're trying to figure out how the game will be played before the game is played. And it's not an easy task, as you can probably imagine. So the way we do stuff, we break people into subgroups, sometimes down to 4 or 5 people at most. Then we'll add a couple subgroups together so that we'll get a bigger group. We'll redivide those groups, mix people up, come back together as a big group. I'll explain what we're doing in those groups in a second. We're going to dissect the whole point of this activity. We want to dissect these large philosophical arguments like I want to build a shooting robot versus I want to build a defensive robot. We're going to break those down into tiny, ridiculous pieces that we can all come to an agreement on because it's a tiny piece and it's very factual based. Once we can agree on 100 of those pieces together, then we'll have a very clear alignment as to what the winning strategies could be, what the winning robot types could be, and we want to understand how those different concepts can complement each other. A good example of this from last year with the fuel shooting robots, it did not make sense to have 3 pure fuel shooting robots on an alliance. It wasn't a winning strategy. And if you went and you did the analysis, the first pass on the time-based analysis, shooting fuel was a good idea because it would give you a ranking point. If you get that 40 pressure, you can get a ranking point. A ranking point means you seed higher. You seed higher means you get to pick a better teammate. That means you should win. But when you get one layer down, picking yourself in that context, picking an exact copy of you would be a terrible idea because now no one's scoring gears, which means you're probably going to lose. So that's it's sometimes obvious, sometimes not, and that's where getting into the different concepts and how they complement each other can really help. And then this is the big one, is it can feel tedious at times as you're going through these really minutia type discussions. It can feel tedious, but this does pay dividends in the end. If you get through these discussions, and this past year for 2018, I think we were able to get this down, this whole process, to do it in basically like 2/3 of one of our weekend meetings. So it was like the Sunday after kickoff. We were able to get to a point where we were like locked and loaded, and everyone was really aligned after that, and we had done all this stuff. So, yeah.
So you call it time-based analysis, but I didn't really hear you talk a lot about time.
Yep. So that's sorry. This was just supposed to be an intro. I'm going to get into what that means right now. Yep. Anyone else? Yep.
So if you have a small-ish team, can you do it all together?
You can. I would still recommend trying to get a couple different groups, because you get this like groupthink thing that happens where good ideas tend to be obvious sometimes, and so people latch onto those good ideas, and therefore you end up with like a one-track mind. Like I said, even if you have a small team, even a group of 3 or 4, I think can work together and really come up with totally different idea than a different group. And help give you a different perspective on things. And you'll see why. And so that's what this is all about. So when I say time-based analysis, I mean time-based, like how long it takes to do things on the field. And this is an example from the 2017 game of a time-based analysis that one of the group 3 did for that game. So you start with autonomous, and you see what you can do there. You're trying to maximize points. You're trying to maximize whatever you can do inside the game. And the groups are free to discuss that and come up with what they think is best. That's the whole point, is that you get a little bit of the subjective opinion of people based on inferences and experience, but it has to be backed up with time and realistic stuff. So if you look, we have this here. Imagine in autonomous, I'm going to start against the wall. That's where we have to start. We know where we have to go. And for this autonomous gear and balls robot, that was like the strategy that they had chosen. We're going to take 2 seconds. The match starts. I'm going to take 2 seconds, and I need to drive to the point where the hopper loader is, and I can collect more fuel to shoot to the robot. So how do we get to 2 seconds? It's just based on historical data. We know that we can't get there in a tenth of a second, and we know that getting there in 10 seconds would be, kind of ridiculous. So we talk about robot speed. We talk about controllable speed, how fast it actually takes us to do it. What ended up happening in our case is it ended up taking about 3 or 4 seconds for us to get to the key, because our motion profile wasn't as dialed in as we wanted it to be. And we also chose a drivetrain that was a little harder to control the motion profile. But we're trying to pick the winning robots here, what robots are able to do. And if you go back and you watch the best robots that did this, a lot of them are hitting that hopper with 2 seconds or less into the match. So it's a pretty good estimate. I think it was hard to be wrong with it. It's about a 10-foot drive, not even 8-foot drive. So, getting that in 2 seconds, if you're plus 1 second, minus 1 second, it's not going to make or break you. But we're starting to dissect that 15-second autonomous period, and we're going to figure out what can we realistically do in that 15-second autonomous period. So we drive to the key, 2 seconds. We're going to take 2 seconds to adjust and aim and allow the fuel that's in the hopper to start falling out of the hopper loader into our robot. And then this group decided that in half a second, they were going to shoot 10 fuel game pieces. So for them to be able to shoot those 10 balls, I should be talking about this one. So the auto ball is only one. So they said they were going to go to the nearest hopper, take 4 seconds, turn around, have their 55 game pieces. That was going to take 5 seconds. Take 1 second to aim, and then they were going to take 4 seconds to fire and score whatever they could in that time frame. So in that case, they were banking on scoring or shooting 55 game pieces, or 40 game pieces. And then they would have 15 game pieces left over. So there were some key assumptions that they had in here. And one was that they needed to fire 40 game pieces in 4 seconds. So that became a big debate point for our team, was how did you get to that point? Because this is something that's never been done before. How did we decide that we're going to shoot 40 game pieces in 4 seconds? Where did you get that from? And so those types of arguments are the ones that are really important, because they're going to lead your prototyping. We don't need to go and prototype how we drive to the key. We don't need to prototype how we aim at the goal per se. We need to prototype how fast can we actually shoot balls, not even necessarily consistently score them, which we obviously want to do, but just purely how fast can we shoot them in a rate. That debate point, and it was a big debate within our team. Some people thought we could only do 5 balls per second. Some people thought we could do 20 balls per second. Some people thought that teams would be able to do up to 30 balls per second. It was a huge debate point, and we couldn't get alignment on it, which was okay, but it meant that we had to circle it and underline it and go, we have to prototype this. There's no way we can make a decision without prototyping. So that debate and all that led to, here's something we really need to understand and prototype. And then you can see some of the other stuff they did. So then they get to teleop. This is what a gear cycle looked like to them. So up here in the center. So they would start at the rotor. So they would start at the airship. They would have to turn and then go to the retrieval zone. So they said that would take about 10 seconds to get down there. So from the time you turn around, get down to the retrieval zone, grab a gear, and then turn around and start heading back. That was based on time, how fast a robot moves, anticipating some amount of traffic or, maneuvering around the field, whether it's their own partners or their opponents. And the teams have to describe this, so you can't just make up 10 seconds without justifying it. You have to tell us why it's going to take 10 seconds, and there needs to be a speed behind it and all that stuff. So they turn, head back to the rotor, back to where they started. They deliver the gear. That takes 1 second. So they were saying it's going to take us 22 seconds, best case, to run a gear cycle. And then they decided to use all their teleop to just run gears. And what does that look like? So they were able to do, and that's what this middle section is, they were able to do 5 cycles of retrieving a gear, delivering a gear. That would take about 110 of the teleop seconds. They would use 20 seconds to, from the gear, drive, grab, and then climb the tower. So after they've delivered that last gear, they're going to line up with the rope and whatever they need to do, climb up onto the davit. That was worth 50 points in the game. So, that's netting them 50 points for doing that activity. And then they had an extra 5 seconds left over that they said they could use it as a buffer, if something went wrong with the climb or whatever. Basically, there was no more time at that point to do anything useful in the match. So they ended up with a bit of a buffer. So they scored 130 points. They used their 135 seconds. In auto, they're saying that they scored their 40 fuel with 100% accuracy. Some people would probably have an issue with that. I don't think any robot ever shot 100% in a match. And then they got their climb. So this is what they come back with. They say, for the entire strategy we did, we're going to score this many points and this many fuel. And so they bring that to the table, and then a different group brings something to the table, and you'll see a lot of similarities. I think when we go back and look at this gear cycle thing, if you guys remember from that game, about 5 gears was about what a good average team did. It was about 5 gears per match. And if you had that average, we consider you to be a really good gear running robot. There was teams that hit 6 and 7. They were super elite, and they were able to cut some of these cycle times down. But in general, the analysis was pretty darn close to what we saw in the real field. And we saw some people come back with a 25-second cycle. Some people come back with a 16-second cycle. But there was a bit of a discrepancy in there. But by the time we averaged everybody together, we ended up in a point where we said, yeah, all right, we know most really good teams are going to score 5 or 6 gears a match. And they're going to, in this case, this robot's going to spend all of its time in auto trying to score fuel so that it doesn't have to score fuel in teleop. We know that in teleop, if we have to score fuel, it's going to take away from our gear cycles, and so you can start putting a strategy together. Yeah.
This is a preview for when you're going to talk about scouting, but did that mean that you guys were in your scouting paying close attention to gear cycle timing?
Yep, absolutely. Right. And so, yeah, if you come to the scouting seminar later, we'll show you some of the data we capture. But yeah, we're capturing gear cycle times. We're capturing how many gears overall you scored. And then there's context here too. And this was something that became difficult at championship. It kind of forced everybody to take scouting to another level, was that everyone was really good at running gears at championship. Most teams could score 4 gears in a match if they needed to. You only needed to score 12. So that meant that even if you were capable of scoring 6, 7, some teams could even score 8 gears a match, it didn't show up in the data because you had partners that were scoring gears and you only needed to score 12. You didn't get any points for scoring more than 12. So if you looked at the data only, you would say, oh, they only scored 5 gears that match or 4 gears that match. What happened? Well, they were with good partners who also scored 4 or 5 gears per match. So there's all sorts of levels, and layers to this stuff as you get into it. But all we're trying to do early here is understand what the game could look like, understand, are people going to be scoring 4 rotors every match, or is it going to be much more difficult to do that, and it may never happen.
So a question for you. This is effectively your theory of the game.
Yep. Game theory.
Have you ever found yourselves, like, as you got into it and said, oh my God, we were wrong? Our basic theory of the game is actually wrong.
So I don't think we've ever gotten to a point where we said it's just wrong. When we did the analysis for the 2016 game, we ended up in the same point. I think it was like 6 or 7 boulder cycles is what an average team or a good average team would do. And we saw people peak to like 8 or 9, balls per match. But that was few and far between. That's like the 1%, performance layer. So I don't think we've ever completely missed. And I think the reason we haven't is because it's all based just on time. It's like there's only so much time you can do things. You can only acquire a game piece so quickly. It's going to take a second, on the field, more or less, for a great intake to acquire a game piece, no matter what. You can only drive so fast in a controllable way. So that any cyclic type game where you're going to have to go back and forth. This year was a good example, again, with Power Up. The big difference for this year was that the game pieces could come from different places on the field. So when we did the time, I probably should have put that one up here, but the time-based analysis for that, people had to say where they were getting their cubes from. And then once you ran out of cubes on the field and you had to start taking longer cycles, your cube count went down. And you had to back that up with data. So you couldn't just say I'm infinitely pulling from this source of cubes that didn't exist. So that was a big part of it too. So yeah, I don't think we've ever completely missed. Is it been, spot on perfect? No, probably not. But I would say it's really close. Definitely close enough to say we want to be a part of this strategy or that strategy for the robot.
I guess I was pushing on you is have you ever had to adjust, like big time adjustment? You had your game theory play, and then you get into the season and go, whoops, this isn't really how it's going to work.
Yeah, so this game was probably a good example of 2017's game with fuel, because that 40 kPa pressure challenge was extremely difficult. And, I picked on the how fast you can shoot a game piece thing. That became like our number one design parameter for our shooter, was how fast we can shoot the game pieces. Then we worked on getting it more and more accurate, as we got through there. But we got to a point where we could shoot 18 balls per second, and it was by far the fastest in the world. Other teams could get to 15 or 14, but the reality was if you couldn't score fuel fast enough where you could actually hit the 40 threshold, it wasn't even worth trying.
Yeah, right.
So the game did get a little weird in that context. When we went to our first competition that year in South Florida, our shooter was coming along. It could shoot at the rate we wanted, but it couldn't shoot in the consistency we wanted as far as accuracy. So we could probably peak something like 20 pressure there, that event, which was good in the earlier competitions. But we were chosen at that competition only because we could score more fuel than anyone else there, not because we could hit 40 pressure, which was our strategy. Our strategy was to hit 40 pressure, rank number 1, and pick the next best gear robot there. In that context, we ended up being picked 2nd or 3rd. We were with a very good gear robot. They chose us as the inverse strategy, where they wanted us to just score as much pressure as possible, knowing that most elimination alliances weren't going to be able to score more than 3 rotors. We had this very stepped, flat scoring. So in that case, we did have to adjust a little bit to just running our fuel only during teleop matches and not worry about gears, because our partners had the gears figured out, and we were just only a fuel robot.
I know I'm asking a lot of questions, but so using this as an example, you said you got better, but you only built 1 box. So
yep.
How did you actually manage to get better when you didn't have access to your box?
So there's quite a few things. So the good thing was we put so much effort into the feeding mechanism that we didn't have to work on that after we built the first one. We nailed that down. But we did need to work on the consistency of the shooter. So we built another shooter. The shooter was mounted to a piece of wood in the middle of our shop, and we used a stream, like a ramp with a bunch of fuel in a row that would just roll into it and shoot from there. And all we worked on was tuning the shooter at that point in time and trying to make it more consistent. Any more questions around the time analysis? So the reality, and like I said at the beginning, all we're trying to do is cut down these philosophical debates into really tiny pieces. how quickly can we do this thing, that thing. We can use, our own experience. We can use other robots. We can use common sense. We can really get to a point where we understand what all these robots are going to be capable of doing. So like I said, we have all the groups come together. They make a presentation. Challenging each other's assumptions is what it's all about. We want to find those common threads. There's a lot of things where people are going to line up and say, yeah, these are all pretty much in check. In this case, it was like the gear cycles. It was pretty much right around that 22 second mark is what we felt like it was a good number for a gear cycle. That was really common amongst all the teams. We start building consensus around that stuff. But then like I said before, there were a few things that we were totally misaligned. People thinking we can score 20 balls per second. People thinking we could score 5 balls per second. Those were very different numbers. And those we circled and highlighted and said we have to prototype this stuff to understand what we're doing here. And then we can start talking about what an alliance is going to look like. So now we can start conceptualizing what those robots and alliances look like. And we're trying to figure out what wins. We want to figure out what the best capable alliance, what's the alliance we're going to see at other competitions. What are they going to look like? We brainstorm what the concepts are, and we're focusing on what they do, not how they do it. And that's all based on our cycles and our time analysis. So we can pick and take pieces and stuff like that and combine them together. So going back to our 2016 example with the defenses, these were all different robots we came up with. We had a climb robot plus a low goal. So it would be a robot that would climb, and all it would do is stuff game pieces in the bottom. So no shooting. We had a robot that was just a defensive robot. It was a low robot, so we could go through the low goal. All it did was break the defenses. We would have a robot that could do the breaching the defenses and then shuttle boulders back and forth if we needed to, or stuff them in the low goal. A pure shooter robot, all it did was just shoot, shoot, shoot. A shoot and climb robot crossed every defense and can climb. A shoot plus just doing one defense, so it could be like a robot that only shot and did just the moat or the rough terrain. And then we had a breach assister robot, which was basically a robot that would go and break all the defenses. They would just do the defenses themselves. So we talked about all those different robots, and you can see like we put the plus the capture or plus the ranking point in there because we felt our time analysis showed that those robots, if they focus on those tasks, could score enough boulders to do a capture, or they could do enough defenses to breach the defenses. And we needed the time analysis to back that up to say it's actually possible to score 8 boulders or something like that in that time frame. And even still, and this goes back to the 2017 example with the gears analysis, it was extremely clear to us coming out of that analysis that it was impossible for a single robot to score 12 gears. It was not possible. And that was proven out. No robot could score 12 gears. I think the most gears scored was 9, and it only happened 1 or 2 times. So stuff like that really puts in perspective. We know that we're not going to run into a robot that can go out there and score 12 gears by itself. So, this is looking at robot alliance conceptualization. We can look at this list of types of robots, and we can sit there and we can go, well, some of these robots work really well together. The pure shooting robot plus the breaching and boulder shuttling robot, those could be really, deadly together. The shooting and climbing robot plus the breach assisting robot, those could be very deadly together. You could start adding them up, and you can understand where the big alliances are going to look like. And then we want to understand our team, and we want to understand, we know what winning alliances can look like now, and now we want to know how do we get onto a winning alliance. That's the whole objective. We want to win. We want to be a part of those winning strategies. So we want to build a robot that's on a winning alliance. So we go back to our previous presentation. For those who are here, I talked a lot about designing for simplicity and understanding what we're capable of applying resources in the right places. You have a strong idea of what robots can win. You have a strong idea of what winning alliances can win. And you've got to be honest about what your team is capable of in that whole thing. It was obvious from the time-based analysis and the scoring analysis we did that a 40 kPa robot was going to end up seating high in the rankings every single time. It was obvious. But then when you look at what the robot is capable of doing, you build the menu, it's got to shoot 10 balls per second or 20 balls per second. It needs to be able to, target the goal. It needs to be able to hit the hopper, pick up fuel from the ground. Like you start adding up all these things, and that's a lot of mechanisms, and it's a lot of time to invest in that strategy. Or we can focus on something that we can become ultimate specialists at. So, and this is my the underlying point is every team can build a robot that's on one of these winning alliances. It's just about being smart about how you think about it going ahead of time. And that's goes back to my case studies that I did in the previous session. There's all sorts of examples out there of teams that kept it simple. They picked a really sure-footed strategy that they knew they could execute, and they had an awesome season because of it. And there's way more examples out there of teams that tried to do things that they weren't really capable of and had a really not very noteworthy season. So the understanding capabilities thing is important. Keep these things in mind. Can we actually build this thing? Do we even know where to start? If we build it, is it controllable? That's a huge one. I think of things like a turret and a shooter. So it's a great idea on paper to lock onto this goal and automatically fire in the fuel. Can you do that? Do you have any legwork that you've started? If you haven't started that legwork in the preseason or on some previous robot, it's going to be really hard to pull it off in the middle of this build season as you're deciding to do it right now. You want to use what capabilities you have in front of you right now. And then keep in mind that several simple tasks may be easier to execute than a single complex one. So in that case, I would say gears plus climbing, two totally separate tasks, but simpler tasks were easier to execute than one, shooting task. That was pretty obvious. And when you added up the points, those gears plus climbing robots, they scored a lot more points than fuel shooting robots did. The difference at the end of the season was that all those robots were now canceling each other out, and it came down to who could score more fuel. But you still needed all these really great gear robots, climbing robots on those alliances for that fuel to even matter. So it's just a good example. Use your goals. That's the big one there. What's your goal here? Do we want to get to district champs? Do we want to be in eliminations every competition? Because if we shoot for the moon and we swing and we miss, then we may not make eliminations because we may not be a good enough first, fuel shooting robot or whatever to be able to plug into an alliance down the road. So your goals are a big, important part of it, and they're going to guide you about those types of decisions. So we're going to strategize. Like I said before, we understand the types of robots on the field. We've narrowed down the concepts, and now it's time to pick the final strategy. We want to list those tasks each of our robots need to complete. So that's going back to our robot menu. What are the tasks that we actually have to do? Remember, some of those concepts that you've chosen have a time-based analysis back behind them now. So if you pick them, it means you're signing up for that robot to be successful to execute it in the time that you think that it'll take. And you're going to want to prototype those items. You want to pick those things and you want to really scrutinize them. If you're prototyping and you're not coming anywhere near, so picking on the fuel shooting again, but if you're prototyping and you can't shoot more than, 4 fuel per second, which is what I would say most shooters that we saw were, is what they would get to. If you couldn't shoot more than that, then you should probably stop. You should probably reevaluate if we're going to be able to achieve this strategy. There's enough time still early in the season, that prototyping phase, for you to come back and reevaluate and look at some of the other robots that you've listed and focus on the right place. So your end result is going to be a list of tasks that each robot will accomplish. So I think the picture's in here somewhere, but we always end up with a whiteboard and it has a bunch of tasks on it. And those tasks are things that we are picking and saying our robot must do these things. Some of them have time-based attachment, some don't, because we don't necessarily need them. And we need to get down to the nitty-gritty. We say this robot type needs to do all these things. This robot type needs to do all those things. And we need to make a decision. So as a group, we've got to decide what's going on here. Hopefully through all the process, you've been talking, you understand each other, you have your goals set, that you get down to this point and it becomes obvious. Everyone wants to go this direction because they know it's the way that's going to be successful. It doesn't always happen that way. I mentioned this before, but we don't vote, and I would suggest not voting yourself, mostly because not everyone in that room is going to be carrying all that stuff, that burden all the way to the end. So you want the whole team invested in an idea and a concept. That way it doesn't come down to, oh, well, I voted for this and therefore I don't feel strongly about that thing. want to build consensus. And the biggest way I found to do that is by that constant separation, small groups back to big groups, divide everyone up differently, small groups again back to big groups. Everyone gets to have their voice. Everyone gets to have their say. They're not put on the spot in this public setting where they have to say what they want to say in front of the whole team and feel embarrassed or anything. It's really effective, and it does help build consensus. So that's a big one. And then you want to highlight these new areas that are difficult. So vision, processing, vision control, that would be a good one. Like, we want to do this, but we don't know how to do vision yet. So we have a huge task ahead of us if we're going to bite this off to understand how we're going to do vision control. If we can't do it, then our robot's not going to be successful, and we're going to have a rough season. So you really want to highlight those things that are going to be unique and different for your team. And so, yeah, this is our picture. So piece by piece, you're going to build up what your robot spec sheet must be now that you've chosen a concept, now that you know all the activities that need to go into it. You're going to separate that into your musts, which is what you've been talking about to this point. The robot must be able to do this stuff in this time frame. Into the wants. These could be things that, like, hey, maybe we might be able to pick up, a gear from the other side of the robot, or maybe that would be a nice to have. Things like climbing. I think that's what ended up in this chart, which I'll show you. You may need to break your tasks out separately as far as like must, wants, and have. So for us, I don't know if you can see this here, but this is for our fuel shooting robot. The must was that it had to shoot 10 balls per second. It was a must. The robot strategy was not successful without it, because in autonomous, it meant that we couldn't score enough fuel for it to matter. Remember, for that game, every fuel that you scored, every single fuel you scored, you had to score 3 of them in teleop to equal the 1. So if we couldn't get it in autonomous, it meant having to score a lot more fuel in teleop, and so that's why it was a must, 10 balls per second. We had a want, or a nice to have, of 20 balls per second because we thought that the really top tier teams were going to be shooting that fast, and that was the goal we went after. You want to get buy-in across the board. It's hard to get this accomplished as you're moving these pieces around. So this was a big one for us. This must column, we had like a lot in there. And remember, I was mentioning all the stuff related to like a fuel shooting robot. We had a hopper intake, so we had to be able to like gather fuel from the hoppers that were on the field. We had a floor intake for the fuel because we felt like if all the hoppers got triggered and we couldn't pick fuel up off the ground and we weren't at the 40 pressure threshold, it would be very silly. We would have a very tough time of it. Obviously, you needed a high goal shooter, 10 balls per second. We had to hit the dumping mechanism for the hopper. That was a robot action. So anyway, there's a lot of stuff going on in this high list. So I remember the debate for this. We had a very strong debate. We knew we needed to climb. We knew we needed to do it. But we had to move it to the want pile because it basically meant we had to focus on this other stuff first, and we had to come back to the climber. That helped us start prioritizing things. Now we know that these musts are things that we have to be prototyping, things we have to be working on. And these wants, they're things that we probably are going to have to get to, but we shouldn't focus on them right now because it's more critical to our strategy to figure this other stuff out. And then the nice to haves, essentially you're putting them out there and you're saying it's very, very, very possible our robot will not have these items. They're nice to haves. And so we ended up with some of them. We can shoot 18 balls per second. That's what we ended up with. Our goal was 20, so we got close to that. A double gear auto we wanted to have. We never did that. A floor intake for a gear, we tried a bunch of times. We failed a bunch of times. We never got that fully figured out. So, like I said, a lot of these things, they were nice to haves, and we didn't get to them. So now the real work begins, obviously. Now you're working really intensely on those new things, the 10 ball per second, the vision processing, whatever new stuff that you think is going to be hard. You got to validate all this stuff, like I said, with prototyping. And you want to keep this basic schedule outlined so that you keep tracking progress here. Like I said, if you have this new thing and you're not making progress on it by the end of the first week, whatever schedule you set yourself to, you may want to revisit and come back and see if it's worth reevaluating the choices you've made so far. And so here's just kind of the way things go after you've decided all this stuff. You're going to prototype. You're going to break things. You're going to manufacture them, break them again, and you're going to keep doing that over and over again until you get to a point where you're totally kind of locked in. or you're out of time. You celebrate failure. That was a big point I discussed earlier. You want to make sure that if things break, you're saying, oh man, how did that break? Why did that break? How can we make it better? Not going, oh man, it's broken. Let's walk away from it and try something completely new. That's part of the engineering process here. Always be thinking of a plan B or even a plan C. That's something I naturally do as kind of the technical leader for my team, but I think a lot of people have that wired into them too. What's a backup plan here? If we can't get this to work, how can we get something else in there? You want to really try to keep that build schedule intact. It's a big one, and I think it's probably the one that most teams miss on each year. It's just you always think you have more time and you don't, but you really want to try to hold it and stay true to it. If you're not meeting it, you want to pull a team together, talk about it, make sure everyone's being open and communicating with it. For those in the district here, which is all of us, I think, you want to use those unbag windows and withholding time, assuming that they exist in the future, to keep improving over time. So I mentioned the new shooter we did. That was like a 4 or 5 pound object. We had 30 pounds of withholding allowance to use. It was easy decision to take it off and work on it, and then put it on the robot once we unbagged it. Practice, that's an obvious one I think everyone's aware of. You want to plan for expansion and improvement. So those nice to have type things, or even those things in the want category, you may want to think about those and how can we plan a space for them on the robot? How can we get to that point where we can add that functionality later on? You want to be prepared for your events. You want to bring spare tools, spare parts, positions. You want to make sure everyone knows what they're doing as far as in relation to the team. That's just general, how are we going to execute these strategies that we've already decided we think are going to be successful. We want to be the most prepared team into a match. Coming into a match with data is the trump card. If you have the data and other teams don't, it's hard to have an argument with you. And you want to be prepared. You want to have watched other teams. You want to have watched the game. You want to know the strategies and the types of robots you're playing with and against. And that's part of taking scouting seriously. And the last one of keeping your ear to the ground. Watch other competitions. Check out what's going on with other robots out there. Don't live in a bubble. Get out there and watch what's happening across first, and maybe you'll see similarities in your robot with another robot that's doing something very successfully, but maybe slightly differently that you might be able to adapt and go. There's nothing wrong with that stuff. That's how teams get better. It's just constantly iterating and working on stuff. So these are a few other resources. You guys can look them up down there. Like I said in the beginning, a lot of these ideas and concepts I've evolved over my 14 years with the Neutrons. Keeping my ear to the ground, I've listened and looked at all sorts of other ways teams have done stuff and come up with this process. So, thanks to these people in particular, but obviously there's all sorts of ideas and concepts out there. So that's what works for us. My contact info is here. Does anybody have any questions?
So scouting studios.
Yeah. Yes. Yeah. Are you going to stick around for the scouting seminar later today?
Yeah.
So I would highly recommend checking that out and give you a good window into what FRC teams do for scouting. And some of it's pretty wild, and pretty intense how deep some teams go. Anything else? We're a few minutes late for lunch, but I think the next seminar started at 1. I believe there's pizza and all that here. So thank you, everybody. And the presentations will be online on YouTube and on our website.
Yeah.
I'm good right now.